It all had to start somewhere. The fantasy film boom of the 80s was a glorious time for we, the children of the VCR and cable. But everything has a beginning, and many would agree that the first out of the mystical gate was Hawk the Slayer. One of my personal favorite fantasy films of all time, Hawk and his crew were a cornerstone of my youth and continue to charm and slay us to this day. So at long last, saddle up and let us travel through the forest of Weir and try to avoid those creepy little puppets. Oh, but we won't be going alone. Every journey into a fantastical magical realm needs a well-versed dungeon master, and we have a great one as professional make-believer and voice of Mel Shep in the Mass Effect video game series, Mark Meer joins us to talk all things Hawk as we peer into the fire and unearth Hawk the Slayer on this episode of Fantasizing About Fantasy Films.
We shall meet again, bearer of the Mind Sword.
Boltan! You will die!
This is a story of heroic deeds and the bitter struggle for the triumph of good over evil, and of a wondrous sword wielded by a mighty hero when the legions of darkness stalked the land. So begins the story of Hawk the Slayer. What follows is surprisingly to some, probably one of the most influential fantasy films of the 80s. Hawk the Slayer set the tone, look, and would inspire many a young artist with its rather gritty take on the genre. The year was 1980, the very start of one of the most epic decades when it came to the best fantasy movies of all time. But before Conan, before Excalibur, there was Hawk and the Mind Sword.
Think of the great sword in your hand, and it will be so.
The film would be the brainchild of director and writer Terry Marcel. Marcel had already been an AD and lead director on a number of films before Hawk took flight, including being the AD for the Sam Peckinpah drama Straw Dogs in 1971 and a number of comedies, including entries in the classic Pink Panther series. He also produced the sci-fi alien hunter film Prey. No, not that one. This one is very different in 1977. Marcel had originally meant for Hawk the Slayer to be a true-to-history piece when he was coming up with the idea, but his love for sword and sorcery stories snuck into his own tale. He and composer and producer Harry Robertson would work together on the screenplay that would bring their shared love of the fantasy genre to life.
Boltan has many men and we are few. If it comes to battle, it will go hard on us.
The story is a straightforward one. Hawk arrives too late to find his own father dying after being attacked by his own son, Voltan, who comes demanding his birthright that his father refuses him, knowing his son is evil. He gives Hawk what Voltan demanded, the last elven Mind Stone, which he places within the hilt of a sword. It's his last act, and Hawk swears vengeance and that his brother will die by the sword.
Boltan! You will die by the sword.
Then a giant animated hawk flies at the screen, screeching death, and the music starts. Every fan grins like an idiot when this happens, because it is awesome, and you can't change my mind. Immediately, the scene changes, and we meet Ranulf, running through a forest badly injured. He arrives at a convent where he loses his hand. Granted, he lost most of it on the battlefield prior to this.
Oh, God in heaven. Oh, what's happened to his hand? He's got no fingers.
He tells his story of how his village was destroyed by a man called Voltan. We cut to Voltan seeking the relief of his facial injuries by a very creepy dark wizard. Voltan's face will never truly heal. The dark wizard prompts Voltan into action, and he and his minions go to the convent, and Voltan and company take leave with the abbess as a prisoner, demanding a ransom or they'll kill her. Ranulf somehow manages to live through this gut shot and heads to the High Abbot for help. The church won't pay the ransom because they don't negotiate with terrorists, but he does give Ranulf a token to give to a man named Hawk.
Now, if you should find him, give him this. He'll know that his help is needed.
Hawk is seemingly always followed by the trilling of a flute when he appears on screen, and again, it's simply awesome. He saves a blind woman who 2 men are trying to burn as a witch. She is actually a witch, but the good kind. Hawk stops the attack using his badass sword, and the woman, she doesn't have a name, she's only called Woman, helps Hawk on what becomes his quest after seeing Ranulph with her magic searching for him.
A one-handed man seeks you. He carries a token.
Ranulph, again, I can't repeat how unlucky this guy is enough, is attacked by bandits who try using him for target practice. Literally. This is when Hawk shows up and saves the unlucky crossbow wielder. Ranulph and Hawk return to the woman after traveling through the very spiderweb-covered forest of Weir, which when the horses get freaked out, the synth really kicks in. It is from here where things really start off, as with the woman's powers and help, Hawk goes and recruits 3 more warriors to help stop Voltan's reign and to rescue the Abbess, Gort the Giant, Baldin the Dwarf, and Crow the Elf. Once the party is complete, Hawk and company go forth to battle Voltan and his horde. We also discover some background on Hawk and his brother and how Voltan's face was disfigured. The bad blood between the brothers goes beyond the murder of their father, but also the fact that they loved the same woman, and she chose Hawk instead. It was Ilion, Hawk's bride, who burned Voltan's face, saving Hawk, but is killed by Voltan in the process. Needless to say, Hawk and Voltan are not fun at family reunions. After some of the heroes falling in the ensuing battle, Hawk wins the day, defeating Voltan and heads off for further adventures. But the film ends with the Dark Wizard carrying off the body of Voltan, aka the Dark One, with the promise to have him rise again when he is needed.
We have further need of you, Dark One.
Hawk the Slayer was not a big budget film. It cost around £61,000 or about $75,000 US to make at that time. And while some of the shots give this away, I'm looking at you, Forrester Weir, and your weird, barely moving Boggling Muppets. The locations, characters, and style make it all great. A lot of the film is shot on location and in wooded areas around England. Again, this was smart for budget, but also adds a grittiness to the story. Also, the fog helps. There's a lot of fog. Actually, I'm surprised a pirate ship filled with undead sailors didn't show up due to the amount of fog. But this adds to the mystique of Hawk the Slayer and the fairy tale nature of the story. Marcel and company made a gunslinger story, but with swords and arrows. Hawk doesn't use a bow, which would typically be what you'd expect for a character based off of Clint Eastwood's iconic Man with No Name. Instead, Marcel's creation of the Mind Sword, which can fly from Hawk's hand in a split second and back again, allows him to recreate the steely stare-downs and close-up eye shots of the spaghetti western in a sword and sorcery setting, while his dueling partner nervously jitters their fingers over the hilt of their own sword. The doo-doo-doo type music that sweeps in on Hawkwind Like Wings that Robertson composed is a straight homage to the classic themes created by Ennio Morricone, but with that added synth rock sound that was becoming a trend and would throughout the decade.
Leave the odds as they are.
The music is as much a character as any of the actual characters in the film, and ties back to what Terry Marcel had intended with a sword and sorcery western. Speaking of the characters, let's look at this cast. John Terry, known to many of you Lost fans as Jack's dad, was Hawk. Terry is a great actor, but some people don't understand his portrayal of Hawk as it can come off as very stiff. That's sort of the point though.
State your business.
Hawk in his steely gaze was inspired by Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name, stoic and silent type. He doesn't show his emotions and is also inspired by the samurai warriors of legend and film, much like the Magnificent Seven borrowed from the Seven Samurai. As I said, he would go on to be known for his work on Lost, but would also join the James Bond franchise in 1987 as Felix Leiter opposite Timothy Dalton in The Living Daylights. He continued working through the 2010s, including being part of the ensemble cast of Zodiac in 2007, and has since retired from acting. Bernard Bresslaw was Gort, the Giant. Bresslaw has been mentioned previously on this series as he was also the Cyclops in Krull. Gort's height wasn't done with special effects, but some camera trickery, although Bresslaw was quite tall at 6'7". Bresslaw had a relatively long history of theater and screen work before sadly dying young at the age of 53 of a heart attack in 1993. He brought a gruffness to Gort, but also a likability and heart.
Some people can never keep their mouths shut.
Gort was often paired up with the dwarf Balden, played by Peter O'Farrell. O'Farrell was also previously on this series as part of the cast of Legend, having played Pox, the pig-like creature in the employ of darkness. O'Farrell was on the shorter side, so having Gort be his foil allowed there to be a very obvious height difference between the two without special effects. Balden was every inch the comic relief of the movie. Even though he's the smallest of the bunch, he matched Gort when it came to appetite. His scenes are just great.
What are they, some kind of fruit?
Fruit, he says.
Well, what are they then?
Those are the finest sugared turkles money can buy.
Turkles?
You long lummox. Turkles. What is it you call them? Lizard's eyeballs.
One of my and many other Hawk the Slayer fans' favorite characters, though, was Crow, one of the last of the elves and an epic bowman. Crow was the strong silent type, much like Hawk. Played by actor Ray Charlson, when Crow speaks, his voice seems nearly emotionless.
One man, on a horse.
This could be because he's speaking in English and not Elvish, but Charlson's choice of how he tackled the character gave him an alienness that truly made him stand out in the film, other than his ears, of course. Charlson is still a champion of the film, and would the following year be a part of Richard O'Brien's Rocky Horror sequel, Shock Treatment. This leads us to The Woman, played by Rocky Horror alum Patricia Quinn. You wouldn't recognize her easily as her eyes are hidden beneath her single-eyed blindfold, and she's wearing a hooded cloak, but her whisper of a voice gives her away somewhat.
And we are complete. The table of 5.
The Woman is very much the opposite of Magenta. She's quiet, subdued, and otherworldly. She also has a magic hula hoop set that lets you teleport yourself and others to and from her cave. Rounding out the cast of heroes is Ranulph, played by the late, great W. Morgan Shepard. Ranulph, as I pointed out, is very unlucky, but takes the shots like a champ. I want to take a moment, though, to talk about W. Morgan Shepard, because he, like the late David Warner, rest easy, King, was one of those actors who managed to become a part of everything I watched. W. Morgan Shepard has a history of work that is nearly unparalleled when it comes to genres like science fiction and fantasy. Between being on screen or doing voice work, he was everywhere. If you look up Shepard's history, it's a list of very nearly every genre epic you can find. Babylon 5, Sequest, multiple Star Trek, Sam Raimi's American Gothic, Quantum Leap, and that's just a few. He brought character to every character. In our episode of Gone But Not Forgotten, Max Headroom, we talk about this history too. But Shepard had such a legacy, I think it needs to be mentioned here as well, as it was one of the first places I saw him when I was around 7 years old and first saw Hawk the Slayer. W. Morgan Shepard would pass away in 2019 at the age of 86, still working a couple of years prior, having been part of the fantasy series The Librarians. His son Mark Shepard is another face and name you'll recognize, as he carries on the tradition his dad started of showing up in literally everything I watch and conquering the lands of genre TV and movies. That's what I call a legacy. Now let's talk villains. The epic Jack Palance played Voltan, the Dark One, and there wasn't a piece of scenery left without teeth marks for the amount of chewing he did.
Take care, little brother. Watch for me in the night.
Palance was at his hissing and glaring peak with Voltan. Never mind the fact that Ferdy Mayne of the Fearless Vampire Killers was nearly the same age as Palance when he played his dad. It didn't matter. Palance is one of the reasons this movie is amazing. The western side of Hawk the Slayer, having Palance in the film, was quite the coup, thanks to his actually being nominated for an Oscar in the classic Shane. Palance would be known for his more villainous roles in his career, and Voltan would be the start of a number of them during that decade. Drogo, son of Voltan, and you have to say the whole thing, was played by Shane Bryant, another actor who would be well known for his villains and came from the House of Hammer Studios, starring in Captain Kronos Vampire Killer and Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, which also starred Darth Vader himself, David Prowse, as the monster. He also did a wonderful turn as Dorian Gray, which was produced by Dan Curtis, around the same time his movie father would star as Dracula for Curtis. Bryant would return to the world of Frankenstein as his Hammer Films character Simon in Sherlock Holmes vs. Frankenstein in 2019. Sadly, he would pass away in 2021 at the age of 74. Hawk the Slayer would see a number of familiar faces for fans of old-school horror from the realms of Hammer and Amicus. Roy Kinnear's father, Roy Kinnear, appears as a rather terrified innkeeper. Patrick McGee, who appeared in a number of horror films during the 60s, including Mask of the Red Death and Dementia 13, shows up as a priest. Marcel had quite a fantastic cast, is what I'm saying.
But I will give you a message. The message of death!
Hawk the Slayer, thanks to showings on TV and VHS, became a cult classic. The film and story itself owes a lot to the rise of Dungeons & Dragons at the time it was released, and there are fans who to this day incorporate characters from the film into their campaigns. Hawk owed more than a little to the success of Star Wars as well, with elements of that film creeping into this movie. Voltan's ever-present helmet, the dark hooded wizard, Hawk's magic glowing sword and abilities, as well as the dark fighting the light, there's an easy way to see the similarities. But also, these sorts of tropes are always a part of the fantasy genre and have been for a while. Hawk beat Excalibur to the punch by a full year, and those same sorts of tropes are key to that classic story as well. That's why Hawk the Slayer has a timeless quality to it, even if you have complaints about the soundtrack dating it. It still holds up because at its core, it's a meshing of classic stories. Fans still love Hawk, and so does Terry Marcel. In 2015, Marcel planned on a return for Hawk, called Hawk the Hunter. At one point, he even said he had Tom Hardy interested in taking on the lead role. Marcel decided to try to do a Kickstarter to fund the film, but sadly it didn't succeed. Marcel's dream had always been to do a TV series based on Hawk. He came somewhat close in 2000 with the series The Dark Knight, which tells the story of Ivanhoe, Prince John, and adds in a healthy dose of magic and fantasy. It also has Peter O'Farrell as the character Odo. It would run for 25 episodes. But Hawk the Slayer's resurrection has actually happened, and it's in part due to the man responsible for The Boys, Garth Ennis, who fell in love with the movie when he was younger. In 2021, Ennis penned an epic comic book series sequel for the film, which picks up after the movie's events and sees the return of Hawk, Gort, Crow, and Voltan. It's bloody as hell, which, come on, it's Garth Ennis, and looks fantastic. Ennis wanted to focus on the characters and keep true to the original film with the comic. The artwork is phenomenal and keeps true to the likenesses of the actors from the film too. It's a 5-issue limited series and will have a graphic novel collection of the issues released next year. Hawk the Slayer keeps finding fans and new life thanks to those fans, be it in D&D campaigns, comics, art, or perhaps someday it will return to the screen. There's just something about this movie that when you see it as a kid, sticks with you, even though some of it you probably shouldn't be seeing at say 5 or 7 years old. The Elven Mind Sword keeps lighting the way for those of us who know that Hawk the Slayer rules.
Beyond those gates will be as darkest night, but the Mind Sword shall light our way.
One of those followers of the sword is professional pretender and dungeon master Mark Meer, who joined me for a fellow geek chat about Hawk the Slayer and how it helped set him on the path through the forest of weird. Hey everybody, I want to welcome to Fantasizing About Fantasy Films a professional pretender and paid dungeon master supreme, Mr. Mark Meer. Thank
Hello.
you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, I'm very excited because I know we both absolutely love the film that is the focus of this episode, which is Hawk the Slayer.
Yes, 1980s Hawk the Slayer. It is one of my favorite movies. I go back and forth on whether it's a guilty pleasure or not, but certainly, yeah, it is a movie from my childhood, and and was the closest thing to a Dungeons and Dragons movie that we had back in the 80s. Of course, now from the looks of things, we're about to get a big budget Dungeons and Dragons movie that perhaps will clear the benchmark set by the Jeremy Irons one. We'll see.
But can anybody top Irons and
he sure looked like he was having fun.
He went for it.
I will say that. Yeah, he certainly did. He
went for it. Another character actor who went for it was Jack Palance in this movie, to the extreme. I think he was making up for the fact that half his face was missing during most of the film because of the helmet. But that eyeball, the one eyeball we had, that conveyed.
Yeah, it's amazing. And if you have the opportunity to watch some of the behind the scenes stuff on Hawk the Slayer, it's really worth the time. I get the impression that Mr. Palance perhaps had not been informed that there would be behind the scenes stuff, or he'd just rather be doing something else. But yeah, it's quite entertaining to watch.
That is fantastic. So I'm going to start with some questions for you, and we can just go for it. How did you first see this film, and how much would you say it influenced your love of fantasy?
I'd like to be able to say that I saw it in theaters. I did not. I saw it on VHS, or it might be, I think I might have seen it on Betamax. And this was when I was visiting Ireland. My family went over to Ireland quite a bit in summers, and I actually have dual Irish citizenship, and my sister lives there now. So trips there were fairly frequent when I was a kid. And we were at the home of a family friend, and their kids had this very extensive, for the time, very extensive collection of movies on tape. And Hawk the Slayer was something I'd never seen before. And they went, I think you'll like this. And I was a Dungeons and Dragons player at the time. I had just sort of begun playing Dungeons and Dragons. And it was a revelation. I remember it as being just, this is fantastic. Why has no one ever heard of this movie? And
the few of us that have.
A few years later, in sort of the mid-late 80s, it eventually made its way to television in Canada. And I recorded it off the TV and had that, it got played so many times, that tape. I had to, basically record it again when I found it, because that tape was just in terrible condition.
Destroyed.
Mm-hmm. But it had everything. It had a party of adventurers. It had a dwarf. It had an elf. It had a giant. We won't mention the fact that the giant was just kind of tall and the dwarf was just kind of short. They often put them in scenes together just to really, play up that height disparity. But, I managed to look past the fact that the sorceress's spells were mostly silly string and ping pong balls, like literally that's what they used. Yeah, hula hoops. That's what they managed to pick up at the dollar store, I think. But it certainly, it's still to this day, I enjoy sitting down and watching Hawk the Slayer.
And that's the thing is, I think when it came over here, I think it was mainly on syndication, and I know CBS late night television played it a lot as part of their like midnight movie type of thing that they used to do way back when. And I think I had to have been 6 or 7 years old when it came out, and I finally got to see it. And it just floored me. I loved it. I don't know if it was the music or what it was. The music itself is its own character, that I call it Hawkwind music. This funky,
that sort of, synthesizer version of it's almost spaghetti western, that kind of tone, and that's certainly the way they approached it. It's great. The composer was one of the producers as well, and the interviews with him are also quite interesting on the extras on the DVD. If you manage to track one down, it took me years to get my hands on.
They're very hard to find. Like, they are rare. And the fact that you talked about the Western, I had just for this, I rewatched it, even though I'd seen it probably a couple hundred times at this point in my life. But there's no shame here. And I forgot how much of a Western Hawk the Slayer is. Like the whole the eyeballs and everything, like the close-ups to their eyes. And it's hilarious because I was watching, I'm like, they're filming this like a gun battle, like a gunfight at the OK Corral type of thing, and it's swords. How is this happening?
Swords and also arrows that are fired very rapidly,
very fast,
and that effect is achieved by just rewinding the film and then playing it forward again. So the elf sort of fires arrows like
Yeah, and it was hilarious. And I'm
crossbow as well. Yeah.
And I loved how they worked it out that I wish I could get the director back, because I interviewed him a while ago, and I didn't think to ask
Terry Marcel.
I interviewed him years ago when they were trying to do another Hawk the Slayer, like a return to it, and they did a campaign.
Yes, that was for Hawk the Hunter, I think it was going to be called.
Yes, and it didn't make it. And I was very sad.
I'm very sad as well. I'm sure there are small pockets of nerds all across the world, probably concentrated in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah. But I was.
Oh, go on. Yes.
Well, I was going to say, like, the fact that they worked it out and how they had the mind sword work, that he could flip it out, like throw this big sword and it would come back and he could throw it again. And that was how they could utilize this as sort of a gunfight. With a sword, and it's definitely not designed to be a throwing weapon. It's like a bastard sword, two-handed sword. It's it's a large sword. I'm like, that had to be a trick to film, but
of course the stone that gives it that sort of telekinetic power where he can sort of summon it back. And this is of course 1980, so I think they might have even beat Empire to the theaters. They came out the same year, and so. If you watch some of the interviews again with Terry Marcel, at the time they were talking about how I think the quote from him is fantastic, which is Star Wars has had its day. That's over now, and this is going to be the new thing. So it was very optimistic on Terry's part, and he had far-reaching plans, because that stone that's in the grasping hand that's on the hilt of the sword, that was apparently only the first, because again, he was quite a visionary. He was going to essentially do the Infinity Gauntlet long before the Infinity Gauntlet, because each movie was apparently going to be about a new stone for the Mind Sword on the which is like basically an Infinity Gauntlet on the hilt of this sword.
That's
so
awesome.
It was going to get a new gem every movie. Very sorry that didn't happen.
Because he had said that was the last elfin Mind Sword, and if that was the case, we missed out. That would have been fantastic to watch. Now, they kind of did a sequel to it, sort of a sequel. He did a TV series called The Dark Knight, and it kind of fell along those lines. And I believe like a few of the actors actually show up in this series.
Jessica, are you telling me that there is a Hawk the Slayer cinematic universe? Is that what?
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. But they did, of course, we do have a comic book that came out like within the last couple of years that continues the story as well. But one thing I wanted to ask you about was the fact that this movie had one of my favorite genre actors in it, and I've talked about him previously in a Gone But Not Forgotten series on Max Headroom that I have written a while back, but I plan on doing a really good homage to him in this, and that is W. Morgan Shepard.
Oh yes, as Ranulph the Unlucky.
Exactly.
And of course, I mean, he's a character actor's character actor. He's in so many things, a lot of genre stuff, as you mentioned. I think towards the end of his career, one of his last projects was appearing with his own son on Doctor Who. Well, playing the same character, not with his son, but they were playing the same character in different time periods. I loved him. The whole cast is really great. Like the number of fantastic British character actors that are in this. Roy Kinnear, famous British comedian who plays the innkeeper. Of course, Patricia Quinn, who is Magenta. Yeah, she is the sorceress, or I think she's just credited as woman in the actual credits. But she's clearly a sorceress. She does magic.
Well, yes, and then Shane Bryant, who sadly just passed away last year, who plays Drogo, son of Voltan, and just an amazing villain actor, like very well known for his deliveries.
And he certainly has I think the most famous line from the movie, and my favorite line, where Hawk tells him to go tell Voltan something, and his line is, "I am no messenger, but I will give you a message." a message of death, and then the fight starts.
I loved him in this. I loved how it was peppered with a lot of Hammer actors, like you said, Roy Kinnear, who his son is carrying on that wonderful work in genre entertainment by playing Frankenstein and Penny Dreadful. Rory Kinnear,
of course, yes, and most recently in Men.
Yes.
Which I still haven't seen, but I
haven't seen it yet either.
All you got to say is folk horror, and that gets me in the door. So I'll be watching that at some point. Of course, good. Also tie-ins to other genre movies of the time. The Bernard Bresslaw, who plays the giant, Gort, he is also the Cyclops in Crawl. Mm-hmm. Yep. And of course, well known for the Carry On movies.
Yes, yeah, and the other actor that, and I absolutely was fascinated by this character. I blame him a lot for my love of elves. Is Crow, played by Ray Charlson, I believe is his name, and Crow the Bowman.
Yes, and a very an atypical choice of characterization from him, from the elf, because he does sound a bit more like an android or a robot, as some people have, or a Vulcan. Yes, very Vulcan. And of course he is like the big visual element in this, because a lot is made of the elf and his elf abilities long before Legolas.
Oh yes,
or at least the film version of Legolas. But the way they pull it off, again, usually just by rewinding the film and playing it again forward, even to the point where he jumps off a rock and fires an arrow, then jumps backwards back onto the rock.
He's hopping around. I mean, they used what they had. I mean,
again, and as a kid, I saw no fault with that whatsoever. It was just like, this is fantastic. This is amazing.
No, it was like the forest of the darkness that they go through.
The forest of Weir.
Yes, and it was basically fake spider webbing that had a green light shined on it. That was the forest with these, I call them the weird Muppets.
Yeah, they're just like little puppets, and they don't actually look that scary. They're more like sort of just lumpy and hairy, and they're
and they're just
again, I suspect it may have been what they managed to locate at the dollar store, or it's like, well, we have this in stock from a failed kids show, we might as well put it in, you know.
Yeah, and I like that they just show them very, very quickly, so that way you don't get to see just how the effects are. But I
there's also, of course, I think they just had like a couple of pythons that they just
they drape on a tree.
They just drape on things, you know. It's just like, put a python on it, and it'll slowly move as the camera pans by.
So I loved the we talked about Jack Palance here, and I found it funny, like the Riff Tracks did a version of Hawk the Slayer that you can get, and it is hilarious, but they point out something that I kind of caught on to when I was younger, which is Jack Palance comes in to kill his father, the father, which is probably only like 3 years older than,
if that. I think Jack might have been older than that guy, but I mean, they certainly, it's like it looked like they're the same age, and
it was hilarious.
I mean, it might have made more sense to go the Hamlet route and make Voltan the uncle, but no, it was brother. Maybe Jack insisted, who knows.
I was like,
but there's quite a gap. I think, you know, he was probably on his third divorce when Hawk was born. But technically they're brothers.
Maybe half brothers. I don't know. It's very strange. But John Terry, this is one of the first, I think, features that he was in. And a lot of people out there will probably know him as Jack's dad from Lost. I know him also from Hawk, but not just Hawk, but from a wonderful H.P. Lovecraft film he did with Chris Sarandon called the
so the Charles Dexter Ward one?
The Charles Dexter Ward one.
Yes.
Everybody should
The Strange Case,
Yes. Everybody should check this movie out. I will find the name of it and before this interview is over. But it's some interesting choices by John Terry in this, because he is very stolid. That was one thing with Hawk. He was very stolid.
Yes, and also, well, I mean, I guess it makes sense that the two guys with American accents are brothers. That's one way, because everyone else is British. He does not even attempt a British accent. Maybe that's wise. Maybe it's better that way. But yeah, he is the hero of the story. And
yes, and he is the delivery is interesting. He's very steely-eyed, I would say, as well. Not a lot going on with Hawk in terms of outward expression, in terms of passion or anger, really. Very much like a Clint Eastwood type.
I'm sure that's what he was going for and how they envisioned him. It is again, lots of sword fighting. So he does that. He swings the sword a lot.
And he is actually riding those horses, which some of those scenes I'm like, wow, that looks dangerous because they're literally riding. I know they slow down the film, but you can see that there's mud, it's slick, and he's on this horse riding, and it's not just him, like there are other actors as well. So
not to mention the fight scenes that take place in just a big cloud of smoke. Several of them do.
A lot of fog.
And again, none of that was added digitally afterwards. They just threw a bunch of smoke into the room while they were swinging around these big pieces of metal. So
and they look solid too. So I'm sure it probably was there was some danger. I would love to find out more about that. Again, I wish I could have gotten a hold of Terry to talk about it, because he is very much loves the story, and it shows, because it's not done for laughs. Hawk the Slayer, while if you watch Spaced, we know that there's some Hawk the Slayer jokiness out there about it, but it's done seriously, and it's done really well with very high quality actors, and it holds up because it's very practical effects, and I think it deserves a lot more love than it gets.
I always sing the praises of Hawk the Slayer whenever I can.
Yeah, I mean, so I know I'd asked you about how it infected your love of fantasy, but you had brought up that this is basically a D&D campaign. It really is. You gather your party, you go forth, and that's what this is. How do you think that Dungeons and Dragons was influenced by this, or how do you think this was influenced by Dungeons and Dragons, because it did come out at the beginning of the real love phase of that?
Yes, I would say that. I mean, it was probably, it's in the ether, it's in pop culture or whatnot, but it was fairly niche in those days. And I think that the filmmakers were probably going much more for the spaghetti Western, which some of the tropes of Dungeons and Dragons, it draws from that as well. And, or for example, the Seven Samurai, like it is essentially a bunch of old adventurers. They were an old adventuring party. They get back together for this mission to protect,
like the Magnificent Seven. Yeah,
exactly. Yes. And so I think from that end of things, maybe not as much. I know it certainly influenced my Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, because I took characters from the movie and liberally added them to my campaigns whenever I could. Sped the Hunchback definitely made a few appearances.
Oh my God, that guy! Oh, he was just wonderful. My husband was watching it with me, and he's just like, "Oh, that's skill when this."
When he's eating like a ham hock or something, a leg of lamb, beer. and beer, and just like delivering all his dialogue with large chunks of meat flying from his face. So, it's almost worthy of the Denethor eating the cherry tomatoes in terms of just like, oh, that's really unpleasant.
Perfect. Well, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to wax poetical about Hawk the Slayer. It is really one of my favorite fantasy films of all time. It kind of opened the door, really. As it did. I mean, first.
You think about the fantasy films of the 80s, and there was like there, as you well know, there was a huge burst of them. Yeah. And it came out in 1980, so it was among the first. Like, what year was Excalibur? That might have been 81.
81. I think it was right after it.
It even beat Excalibur. So I don't know how wide a net it cast, but in terms of actually getting into the theaters and in front of some people, it was among the first.
Yep, it was the one that Hawk kind of broke down the door with that screech of at the beginning, and
from the cartoon bird. Yeah.
From the cartoon bird. Yes. And I absolutely loved it. Thank you again for taking the time. And The Resurrected is the name of that movie that John Terry was in with Chris Sarandon. Fantastic movie as well. Definitely check it out if you're a Lovecraft fan. I know he is, if you couldn't tell from the things in the background. But thank you again, Mark. Have a great day. And thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Jessica.
You have a good one.
You as well.
Bye-bye.